Where you headed, gringo? Tamela, I was standing on a lonely dirt road in the Peruvian Andes, about 12,500 feet up into the air, and a lone motorcycle rider came past, and I called out to him. And I couldn't have realized in that moment how that chance encounter was going to so radically change my life. I was a lot younger then, and divorced, drunk, pretty out of control. I was riding with a bunch of wild boys. We'd started in Guatemala 6 weeks earlier, and we'd ridden about 6,000 miles through 9 countries, and we'd got drunk, we'd fallen down, we'd crashed our motorcycles. We ran from the cops, we'd busted military checkpoints.
Ugly Americans.
Yep, we had chased girls in discos and basically treated South America like it was our own personal racetrack. And that lone rider that day was a Canadian priest by the name of Father Giovanni Battaglini. And he was on his way to the small village of Ollantaytambo, which is the last stop before you go to Machu Picchu. And we eventually crisscrossed each other's paths, and we traveled on together.
For about 3 days, is that right?
We ended up spending about 3 days together, and we traded our life stories in that uncensored way that travelers often do. And I learned that he had grown up in Canada, went to college, become an engineer, and then turned his life to God through a series of things that happened to him. And he went on after the seminary to go to Newfoundland, and but his heart was with the poorest people on the earth. And he went to Peru, and that's how I found him, traveling from village to village. And he didn't only bring faith. I mean, as an engineer, he put greenhouses, did irrigation projects, education, health for his children. And he even at times used himself as a human shield, sort of getting in between the Shining Path guerrillas and his people.
So that would have been like the early 90s.
This was the early 90s, yeah. So, for me, it was one chance encounter that changed my life on a motorcycle. But I know for you, it was a series of chance encounters that changed yours.
I think I needed more chance encounters because maybe I was a little tougher. But yes, I had the good fortune, 3 months after I learned the difference between the brake, the throttle, and the clutch on a motorcycle, I set off on a 40-day odyssey of self-discovery.
A little biblical there.
A little bit biblical.
It didn't rain though.
Lack the rain. And before I set out, I was doing my prep, and I was looking for something charitable that I could do along the way. Motorcyclists are a pretty charitable tribe, and I thought maybe there was a run of some sort, maybe a Make-A-Wish Foundation or something. And I found a group of women who had breast cancer as their cause. And they had a very unique way of raising awareness and money for this cause that they were so passionate about. They would bling up their bikes in pink swag. And I'm talking feather boas. One of the women made a slip cover, a pink sequined slip cover for her bike.
Not something I do.
I know. And honestly, breast cancer is sort of the 800-pound gorilla in healthcare fundraising and so forth. And I initially wasn't inclined to join. I thought, what could I do, for this mighty cause? That, maybe I could find something that I could do a little something for. But when I learned that they would be rallying in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the exact day that I planned to be there, I felt the hand of Providence sort of tapping me on the shoulder. And I said, okay, I'm in. So I strapped a pink bra across the front of my windshield.
As you do.
As you do. And if you're ever inclined to do this, Neale, here's what you're in for. I was unprepared that everywhere I stopped, scenic overlooks, restaurants, everywhere I stopped, people would approach me and say, I want to tell you my cancer story. And it wasn't just their diagnosis, their path with cancer. People wanted to tell me about a loved one, a colleague at work, a neighbor. I heard a lot of stories. I want to tell you about my mother. I heard a lot of that. And so as I was holding space for people to tell me about a loved one, I was so moved especially by the stories where people told me how they were taking out second and third mortgages to pay for excruciating care, because what they wanted most was some sort of human milestone, a family milestone. They wanted to be there to see a child graduate, or to greet and hold a grandchild, to see a wedding. For these people, life was very precious. I would go so far to say it was priceless. And that was so important for me to hear, because at that particular time in my life, I felt that life was cheap. My own life particularly, because 2 years before, I had almost taken my life in the wake of a business loss. And nothing was that precious to me, as I was hearing on the road.
I mean, physically, you're here, and obviously come through that, but how did you get from there to be on the road on your motorcycle?
So, it was 2008, and the whole world was melting down. Governments, companies, everything was in meltdown. And so was my business. So, as I was winding down this business, you can imagine everybody needed money, because there was none. And I and friends and family had invested hundreds, plural, hundreds of thousands of dollars in this failed business. So my phone rang constantly. It was vendors, it was creditors, but it was also people that I know and love. And they were saying, "Where's my money? What's your plan for getting me my money?" Plan? I didn't have a plan. I needed a plan. So Neale, you know what an earworm is, right?
I do.
Usually I get these earworms when I accidentally listen to my kids' radio station. I jump in the car and they've been listening to the radio. An earworm is this, unpleasant song that you can't get out of your head. And so in 2008, the unpleasant earworm in my head was my plan. And this unpleasant earworm said, Tamela, if you take your life, the life insurance money will at least pay some of what they've invested back. So I found myself in front of a medicine cabinet, surveying analgesics, cough syrup, and laxatives.
The downside of clean living.
And I realized that, this combination was only going to be unpleasant. It was not going to be fatal. And clearly I had reached, the bottom point. And also, I should say clearly, someone who's in good spiritual and psychological health doesn't hear an earworm like that, much less attempt, to act upon it. So my first order of business, of course, was getting my head straight and my heart straight and my soul on. And then I started hearing this other voice in my head. And this other voice said, "Tamela, you need to learn to ride a motorcycle. And then you need to take a cross-country motorcycle trip." Now, who hears a voice like that, right? Particularly in my circumstances. But, it was a friendlier voice than the other one. And so, I had sort of gotten into a spiritual place where I accepted that I could have guidance that maybe was inexplicable. And so everywhere I went, I started saying to people, "You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to learn to ride a motorcycle, and I'm going to ride from here to the Pacific coast and back." Now, the truth of the matter is, remember, I'm flat, busted, broke, and it takes money to get on the road. You got to buy gear, you got to get training, you got to have road trip money, and you have to have a motorcycle. I had none of that, but I just kept saying to people, "I'm going to learn to ride a motorcycle, and I'm going to take a cross-country motorcycle trip." And a series of miracles happened. And I got everything I needed, including that motorcycle. And so, Neale, as I was on the road, holding space for people, here's what I learned about life. They thought that I was giving them a gift by letting them tell me their story. And the truth is, they were filling up my cup. And that's what service always does. It's always working in both directions. It was redemptive. Enough about me. What happened when you got back from Peru?
Well, I left Peru, Tamela, and I went back to Florida, and that's where my job was. I was working in a motorcycle shop. And I had this feeling like you get sometimes before you get a cold. It's the day before, you're kind of achy and grumpy, and you don't know what's happening, and the next day it all hits the fan. And I went to work one day, and a guy walked into the shop, and he comes up to me and says, "Hey, Neale, I just spent $5,000 buying chrome for my Harley." And I said, "Well, you're a fucking idiot."
Which is like customer service 101, right?
Right. So I was like, so it was out. I mean, I was done. And I absolutely knew in that minute that I had to go. And I tried to make light of it and smooth them over, but that wasn't going to happen. So I quit my job.
Before you got fired, you quit.
Quit my job, quit drinking, and in this coincidence that I didn't really realize at the time, I took $5,000 cash and I put it in the money belt. And I took off to Europe. And I bought an old motorcycle, very similar to the one Tamela's got here, spent a couple of months getting it ready, and I headed out to mainland Europe. And it was just so, it had incensed me that I had just been 6 weeks in South America and had spent about $1,500 riding a $300 motorcycle through all these countries and had all of this experience. And to spend that much money bolting shit onto a bike that doesn't go anywhere just drove me nuts. So over the next 5 months, I rode to the four corners of Europe. I went through 23 countries, 17,500 miles, and I wrote in my journal every day, traveled alone, camped out.
And you've been writing to Geo for the whole...
I'd started writing to Geo. I mean, we did airmail letters in those days. It was before phones, for those that don't remember that, back in the deep, dark, distant past. And so about 5 months into the road, I found myself looking at the lights of Northern Africa in Tangiers. And I was so lonely, cold, tired. It had been a tough trip through Spain in torrential rain on a motorcycle. And I was at this decision point, do I use the remainder of my savings and go on to Africa and sort of further disenfranchise myself as this lone traveler? Or do I go back to America and get an education and have someone pay me to ride motorcycles around the world? So, you see, I had no education at the time. I left school at 15 and just been on the road and wide open ever since.
And we've talked about this, how so many times young people these days, they don't experience life. They just, go off to school. And yours is a story of how you really got an education when you left school at 15 and traveled the world, and you learned a lot about people and geography, so...
Well, I made the decision to go back and take some schooling, and I went back to Florida, enrolled in a business school, and I bought an old house. And, I really wasn't thinking too much about Geo and what his influence in my life was at that point when a young drug addict by the name of Eric came into my life. And Eric's claim to fame was he had actually had his heart stop long enough in an ambulance that they were about to pronounce him dead, and someone got him back. And he was pretty out of control, and we started drinking cups of tea and hanging out. And we traded horror stories, and, I had a few to tell him. But I think at that point, I was something of a beacon to him. I was, sober, going to school, fixing up a house. I'd done this significant travel. And when he walked into me one day and said, "Neale, I'm going to go straight," I looked him in the eyes and I said, Eric, I believe you. And he went on to go to school.
So that was like Geo tapping you on the shoulder.
Yeah, maybe I was sort of more in a mentor role to Eric. So I got my education, and I'd been writing voraciously to Geo at that point, and he was same way. I mean, I have airmail letter after airmail letter from him. And I started my career in journalism, and I started traveling the world. I rode the most exotic wild bikes everywhere from Namibia to Australia to Japan. You name it, we rode there, and fast and hard. And I didn't notice that Geo's letters had stopped. I'd started a family, was having kids, and you just get in that busy space. And when I got a letter from Father Giovanni's sister, I think it was about 2004 at Christmas, to say that, celebrating, it was, so many years since he'd passed away. I mean, my legs were just taken out from underneath me. So I started communicating with his sister, Maria, in Canada. I learned that he had been taking supplies to his people and basically got hit in his truck. And the result of it is we went down to a place called Hogar Belen in Peru. It's right in the southern desert. And it was one of the things that Geo used to take care of. There was a bunch of abandoned kids there. And it was a big project for him. So we performed a medical mission, came back to America, and started Wellspring International Outreach, which is my charitable foundation. And this is my little sweetheart, Kathleen. She's completely brain dead, but she's sweet. And life carried along. And it was an interesting twist of fate at that time. I had moved my career and I was doing television. I was traveling around the world with well-known TV celebrities on those cars. And at the same time, I was doing conventional fundraising. And neither of them were working out just how I wanted them. The travel show was nice, but a little foo-foo. And the fundraising was pretty hopeless. I wasn't much good at it. And I realized I was going to be 184 years of age before I ever got these kids a home built. So something had to change. So I had this moment where I sort of took the TV show and the charity idea, put them together and said, I'm going to make a TV show where we ride around the world, taking people on a journey, and we'll take them to see these kids and raise money and raise awareness. So in July of 2013, Neale Bailey Rides aired on the Speed Network, and the children of Hogar Belen made it onto television. Wellspring went on. We had our best year to date. Now I'm surrounded by a team of amazing volunteers, and I get to carry on Father Gio's work in Peru. And not only that, I get to keep telling his story, which I've now been telling for 19 years. So that chance encounter really changed my life, and hopefully it'll change a lot of other lives around us.
Already has.
And I know your chance encounters really changed your life too.
It did. I actually went on to become a writer. And like you, being on the road, journaling. I mean, I had collected a lot of stories. And I had also become friends with several of the women in this group, many of whom had cancer. And so as I thought about the bounty that I had been given with all these beautiful stories, I decided to share them in a book. I shared 8 of the life lessons.
An award-winning book, I might add.
Thank you. I shared 8 of the lessons that I learned in that book. And winning awards is terrific. But what I really love about the work that I did is that now hospitals, cancer treatment centers, cancer support groups across the country, and I'm told in Canada, are using that book with both patients and their families and loved ones, which is very rewarding. And on that chance encounter note, I also learned that there's a penitentiary in Ohio where they're using that book. They started using it with the inmates who had cancer, and the other inmates learned about the kinds of conversations that had been initiated because of the book, and they asked to be included. And the only way I found out about that is because I met one of the penitentiary workers at Lake Tahoe at a Women in Motorcycling conference. She just told me this. I had no idea. Chance encounters.
Well, guys, you don't have to go out and learn to ride a motorcycle and travel around the world to have a chance encounter to change your life in a significant way, perhaps the way that Tamela and I did. So we came up with an idea for you.
So at the end of our time together tonight, what Neale and I would like for you to do before you leave the building is find someone you've never met before, turn to them and say, "Where are you headed, gringo?"